14 and verse 27, just let me read that verse to you to springboard off of our thought. Jesus speaking says, "Peace I leave with you. My peace give I unto you, not as the world giveth, do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled. Let not it be fearful." Peace in the midst of panic and persecution is what we're looking at. Jesus said that he would leave his peace with us, a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that we're to let rule our hearts in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 15. Yet, due to the recent political shift and all the deception involved, whether it be through politicians or the press, it seems like many Christians, that at least that I know of, are sounding more like first century zealots. You remember what a zealot was, right? A zealot was a political movement in the first century, Second Temple Judaism, that sought to incite the people to rebel against Rome and to overthrow them with arms, to take up arms and to overthrow the Roman government. What's interesting to me is, if you recall, Jesus and his staff of 12, there was Simon the Zealot. But you never do read anywhere within the Gospels of Simon coming to Jesus and saying, "This isn't right, what Rome is doing isn't right, we ought to take up arms and overthrow the government." You never hear that. You never hear Jesus calling for his disciples to take up arms and overthrow the government, even though it was corrupt. And the reason why, because Jesus, of course, understood the power of God. You remember in Matthew 26, he had told his disciples, "Can I not now call down 12 legions of angels if I so desire?" He understood his place, his role, the perspective that God's followers were to have. Pastor Randy brought that out last week as Jesus told the disciples, "Give unto Caesar what belongs to him, and to God what belongs to him." And he understood, obviously, the ultimate purpose of God, and that's seen in his high priestly prayer when he prays that God would be glorified. So now you remember we talked about the power of God over governments, past, present, and future last time, and this is most clearly seen in Romans 13, verses 1 through 5, and in the book of Daniel, which the pastors taught just last year, and in the book of the Revelation. Again, past, present, and future, those political systems God has ordained. There is yet to be, in Daniel, another revival of the old Roman Empire under a 10-nation confederacy that, again, God is going to bring to pass, and out of that confederacy is going to come who the Bible calls, and we studied this on Wednesday nights before, the little horn, or the willful king, the son of perdition. Paul calls him the Antichrist. So God has ordained past, present, and future governmental systems. We also looked at God's sovereignty over sin, the sin that's involved in these systems, how he permits some sins, how he prevents some sins, and how all of these sins which are going on are for his purpose, or he has a purpose for them. Now, some, and maybe you've experienced this, I know that I have, some people have trouble, find it difficult to understand how God's will affects or even directs the hearts of men. I have an outline. I put a couple outlines out there for you on the table. One is a nice little neat outline, little half sheet of paper out there on the table right behind the sound system in the foyer concerning God's dealing with men's hearts. A lot of these verses are just very explicit verses that talk about how God hardens, he abandons, he stirs up, he turns, changes, opens, quickens hearts, the hearts of men. You'll find all the scriptural references to those. And I did something a little bit different as well. I was telling Megan, I know, at least for me, I'm a little bit different. Rather than have a nice, neat outline, I know if Pastor Jeremy or Andrew or Luke or one of them was to preach or Pastor Doyle was to preach, rather than having the nice little neat outlines, I would rather have their chicken scratches when they're making their outlines with their little thoughts and rabbit trails. And so I put one of them as well out there on the foyer for you, if you like that, because the little condensed outline of how God works in people's hearts. There's only a couple references there, but in my notes, there's like quite a few, several dozen notes there. So if you want any of those, you can grab some of those out there when you leave and look over those. So this morning, what we want to look at is God's sovereignty over sin, how that he prevents some sin. So look at Genesis chapter 20 and verse 6. Now, we're talking about us having peace in the midst of panic, when others are panicking because of the political situation and the changes that are going on. How we can have peace in the midst of panic and eventual persecution, which I believe is to come sooner or later. Genesis chapter 20 and verse 6, we'll look at several verses that talks about God preventing some sin. Randy, would you look up 1 Samuel chapter 25? 1 Samuel 25. And then, Tom, you want to look up Psalm 105? And we'll look at some verses there. And then, Brad, would you look up Proverbs 21 and verse 1? Proverbs 21 and verse 1. And then we'll look at some passages in Genesis. Let me give you Genesis chapter 20 first, verses 1 through 6. This is about Abraham going down into the desert there, you remember? And Abraham in verse 2 of chapter 20 says to Sarah, his wife, he tells her, say that you're my sister, so that when we go down in there, everybody sees you, they see that you're beautiful, they'll want to kill me and take you. And so she does that. And so in verse 3, we read this, but God came to Abimelech, who had seen Sarah and took her. He comes to Abimelech in a dream that night, and he said to him, behold, you're a dead man, because the woman whom you have taken, for she is married. Now Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, wilt thou slay a nation, even though it's blameless, as far as in this instance, he didn't know, obviously, that Sarah was Abraham's wife because she had said that she was his sister. Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he's my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocency of my hands have I done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that in the integrity of your heart you have done this, and I also kept you from sinning against me. Notice that. God says, I prevented you from sinning against me. Turn over, if you're following along with me in Genesis, just a couple instances. Chapter 31, look at that if you will. Genesis chapter 31. Genesis chapter 31, this is the story, of course, of Jacob when he leaves for Canaan. And then when he goes to take a wife, and he's worked for two wives under Laban. And now we're going to read of he takes his wives and all his belongings, and he's going to leave and go back to Canaan. And in chapter 31 and verse 24, of course, Laban hears this. He's furious. He's going after him. God comes to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream of the night, and he says to him, be careful that you do not speak to Jacob, neither good nor bad. So again here, God is limiting Laban and what he will do. In verse 29, Laban is addressing Jacob here, and he says, is it not in my power to do you harm? But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to speak either good nor bad to Jacob. Verse 7 of that chapter, he says, yet Jacob talking about Laban, he says, yet your father cheated me. He's talking to his wives about their father Laban. Yet your father cheated me and changed my wages these 7 times. However, God did not allow him to hurt me. So again, we're talking about God limiting some sin. He permits some sin. He limits other sin. Proverbs 21 and verse 1. Listen to that. Proverbs 21 and verse 1. Now think about that for just a minute. Think about the situation we're in. Think about the fact that God has ordained all governments, past, present, and future, about how those kings' hearts are in the hand of God. Caesar, Nero's was, Domitian's was, Trajan's was. The Antichrists will be. And yet God permits some sin. Now, I bring this up again and again, and I wrote up this outline about how God moves in people's hearts, because some people are actually very antagonistic, Christian people, very antagonistic towards other Christians who would even suggest that God permits sins, let alone allows sin or ordains or has decreed sin to come into being. Right? Chapter 35 of Genesis in verse 5. Let me give you just one more reference, and then we'll read the 1 Samuel reference, and then see if you have any comments so far on this. Chapter 35, this is Jacob, of course, moving to Bethel. And then in verse 5, he says, as they journeyed, there was a great terror upon the cities which were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And of course, that terror came from the Lord. The Lord had prevented them from coming against them. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 26.
Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, since the Lord has restrained you from shedding blood and from avenging yourself by your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek evil against my Lord be as the wall.
And then verse 39. This is, you remember the instance where David is fleeing, and then he's keeping Nabal's sheep and protecting the herdsmen there. And he sends some of his men to go and just reap some sort of reward from doing that. And Nabal's like, I don't know this David or where he's coming from or where he's going. I'm not doing anything for him. And he dishonors David's men, sends them away. And then David's, of course, furious, and he's wanting to kill him. And he goes to do that, and he's approached by Abigail, I think it is, Nabal's wife, who speaks those words. And then verse 39 as well.
When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from evil. The Lord has also returned the evil doing of Nabal on his own head. Then David sent a proposal to Abigail to take her as his wife.
So again, David says that God had kept him back from killing Nabal. God can take care of things himself, much better than we can. And that reminds me, so I wasn't going to get off on this, but I hadn't even thought about it. When I was down south, some people that the Lord had directed me to in my path, I was struggling as a young Christian trying to figure out what a Christian was. I didn't know, but wasn't raised in church, didn't have any idea. I was struggling going to church because I was convicted of my sin, but I wanted to go to church, and so I didn't really understand it was yet a relationship with God. And sometimes you do good, and sometimes you don't. And it was just a relationship, and I really didn't understand those things, even though that seems simple to many of you and to me now. And so God had directed me and put me in the path of a man who 3 years prior to that, who was told that he had 3 months to live. And so I got to spend those 3 years just watching him and his relationship with the Lord and understanding that's what Christianity was, a relationship with God. Their daughter was killed by her husband, murdered by her ex-husband, who had left town. They had divorced. He left town. He came back. He had murdered her. He had set their house on fire. Zuline was the woman's name. She had proof of this. She could prove this. The whole family had told her, you need to go to the authorities and tell this, let them know. And she said, I want to, but I just feel like God is telling me not to. And that he's going to take care of this. And the family was pretty irate about it, pretty angry about it, as you can imagine. Well, the guy who had done this was remaining in town, was gambling with some folk and won quite a bit of money from a guy who owned a bar. Went back to the bar. The guy said, I have the money, I can pay you. You'll have to come back to my bar and get it, though. He followed him back to the bar, and the bartender shot him. And Zuline took that as God's permitting him to be killed in that way. The point is, God can take care of things much better than we can. The wrath of man doesn't work the righteousness of God. God will take care of things his own way and his own timing, much better than we can. Psalm chapter 105, verses 12 to 15. Psalm 105, verses 12 to 15. We're talking about how God prevents some sin.
When there were only a few men in number, very few, and strangers in it, and they wandered about from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another, from one kingdom to another people, he permitted no man to oppress them, and he reproved kings for their sake. Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm.
So again, God preventing others from harming his children. Look at verses 24 and 5 as well, Tom. Psalm 105, verses 24 and 25.
He caused his people to be fruitful and made them stronger than their adversaries. He turned their hearts to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants.
Would you read that 25th verse again?
He turned their hearts to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants.
Do you have a problem with that verse? Did you hear what he said? God turned their hearts to hate his people. Now, I'm not sure what you could do with that verse if you don't believe that God has anything to do with people's hearts, or what are your thoughts on that? Any thoughts at all? None? Yeah, Pastor.
I have to say, for me, it's a great comfort. It changes the way that I look at things, changes the way I pray. Oftentimes, I think my prayer is for God to give certain people favor in the eyes of other people in their lives, whether they're in the workplace around lost people, or you know what I mean? It just depends on the environment. I can pray that way knowing that God can do it. If I didn't believe God was sovereign over hearts, and couldn't make people like you or hate you or whatever, I couldn't pray that way. I pray, oh God, please arrange the events to somehow influence these people, maybe, to like this. You know what I'm saying? So it really gives me great comfort. I don't understand all the inner workings of it, but it gives me comfort.
So somebody play devil's advocate to that. You, that's not why you raised your hand? Is that what that's not fair. How can God do that? How can God do that? And then still hold people accountable?
I would say in my line of work, my biggest stressor, my own problem, is I go to a crime scene and I handle investigations and I'm in control of it. And I almost in my mind, I put myself as in the place of God. I'm going to solve this. I'm going to make this right. And then other entities, some things change and justice isn't able to be served when it should have been. So I just need to focus on the fact that God has this, and whatever his will is what's going to happen.
Any other thoughts? I know some of you have backgrounds, do you not, that don't teach the sovereignty of God to this extent. Am I right? Do some of you have those sorts of backgrounds? What is the general sort of thought and thinking of those who don't believe that God is involved in allowing or sin? Think about this question. Why, if God could prevent some sin, why didn't he? Why doesn't he? Yep.
I don't know if I exactly what you want me, but I think there's people that think that when things go well, God's in charge. When things are going bad, Satan's kind of got in charge. We're going to pray God to go get him and turn it around on us, and you hear that. And that's why these verses are so important, to show that that's not the case. God's in control of all things. When things go well, there's a purpose. When things aren't going well, there's a purpose.
So Randy said that sometimes some people think that when things are going good, as they define good, that's God. God's doing that. And when things go bad, it's not God. God wouldn't allow someone to get cancer. God wouldn't allow someone to be murdered. God wouldn't allow someone to be abused. That's the devil. The devil's doing that. What are your thoughts about that? Is that true? Not true? Jane?
I feel like I find myself sometimes getting into that, well, that's not fair situation, and when you really trust God's sovereignty, you can be at peace no matter how bad it is. Whereas this
Now, maybe, I mean, what if you're someone who doesn't agree with that, though? A Christian who doesn't agree. There are a lot of Christians who wouldn't agree with that. Right? Yeah, Luke.
So I grew up in a context, kind of what Randy mentioned for sure, like devil and God are kind of going at it. Most of the time God wins, once in a while, devil might. And, but also there was kind of an understanding of God, it was kind of what I would call a soft prosperity gospel church. Like, not everyone's going to have a Lexus, but in general, God wants abundant life was always the kind of catchphrase. So God wouldn't want bad things to happen to you. It was kind of like, so that is happening. It's not because God wanted that to. So there was something about God's ultimate goal that he had in mind, I think, was kind of the key missing factor. What does God want for you?
Any thoughts about that? Do y'all not have any friends or encounter any other Christians who have trouble with what we're talking about? Yeah, Tom.
About the devil's advocate, I mean, it might be that they would look at it as God being the author of sin.
Sure. Right? What do you say to that? The way that you guys are talking to me about how you believe that God allows sin, how God can prevent sin, but he still allows it, how that he even permits some sin. Isn't God the author of sin then, if that's what you're saying? I mean, isn't he being mean toward innocent people? What were you going to say?
Well, I don't remember just before that, but something I had just read this morning that is in the middle of Lamentations, I think, chapter 3. You know, that God doesn't delight, even if he's allowing, which means, however you want to say it, allowing, not allowing something hard in your life. He doesn't delight in doing that, but he has this kind of what Luke was saying, the ultimate goal in mind for us. But I think, I remember I was going to say, to me, I feel like as a believer, if I have the mentality that God is not sovereign over the hard circumstances in my life, then I kind of live as a depressed person without hope, because I'm always at the whim of the devil. Whereas if I see God as sovereign, then I can trust, okay, there's that ultimate goal that he has for me, or I can say God is sovereign and look at his sovereignty in my life through a sinful way, saying, well, if he's sovereign and he's bringing this, then he must not be loving. So then I can still fall into that sin, and I have fallen into that sin. But to me, it's much more hopeless to say that God doesn't have control of our hard circumstances.
Have you ever asked your friends that question who struggle with this? The alternative, who say that God's not sovereign over sin and all that? Well, if he doesn't allow it, then who's in control? He's not sovereign at all. And how can you pray for people, for God to change hearts if he can't change hearts because he's burglarizing their will? Right? That seems much more hopeless, doesn't it? Than knowing that he's sovereign and struggling with, okay, God, I know that you're sovereign. I know that you're wise. I know that you're loving. But this doesn't feel like any of those things to me. Yeah, Morgan.
So I have a question. I think the people that or at least especially in our current situation, it's not been like, that's not fair. It's been coming up. It's been more of, well, I believe in God's sovereignty, but God uses people to accomplish his will. So I feel like, the government's not going good, so I'm going to overthrow the government. Or like someone like Bonhoeffer. You know what I mean? He believed like God uses people, and he does. But it's like we don't, you can believe that God is sovereign, but not see exactly what his hand is doing, because like his ways are higher than our ways. We don't have infinite knowledge. You know what I mean? So I feel like that's the struggle that I hear, that I almost am like, oh, you do something, you not do something, or like, whatever context it is,
So say that again now.
So,
But simpler, I mean. You're saying some people will do things and then say, well, God was in that because he's sovereign and I did it. Is that kind of where you're going?
or like go,
Like Bonhoeffer.
yeah, like go believe in the sovereignty of God, completely agree with what we're saying. But if the don't want us in power, or, I mean, like, or just something's not going right, then they'll be like, oh, well, I need to change this because.
God's going to use me to change this.
Right.
Now, what are the boundaries that they might use to be used to make the change? In other words, do they use Scripture? And are they confined by Scripture? Here's what I can do. Here's what I am to do and to be able to affect change. Or I'm just going to run roughshod and go storm the abortion clinic or the Capitol with a gun. Anyone. Anyone who wants to comment on that. I wouldn't do that to you, Morgan. Yeah.
I was just gonna, I think Deuteronomy 29:29 is such a blessing in moments like that, where, it says the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but that which is revealed belongs to us and our children forever, that we may do all of our works according to this law. I think, that's our, those are the lines on the side of the highway that keep us, on the right track. We stay in the Scriptures, we do what God's revealed will is, what He's told us He wants from us. And then we trust the secret or the hidden or the future things to the Lord.
Yes. Right? God also purposes or limits sin. We've seen this in Job 1:12, Job 2:6, Isaiah. Look at Isaiah chapter 45. Here, this is a good one. Isaiah 45. Luke, would you look at Genesis? Look at the book of Genesis. We're going to look at just a couple excerpts of the life of Joseph. That's a good example. Look at Genesis 45, 5 through 8, and then Genesis 50:20. That's the popular verse there. Isaiah chapter 45, and we'll look at least verses 1 through 6, and try to move on and get into our role or our responsibility. All right, are you there, Luke? Would you read Genesis 45, verses 5 through 8? Now, you remember the story of Joseph. The Bible says in chapter 30, his brothers could not speak well of him. I mean, they hated him because of his favor with their father and because of the dreams that he had that indicated he was going to rule over them. They were furious with him. Matter of fact, if you read that story when they threw him in the pit, and you turn over to chapter 42, it tells that when they're confronted and when God is really dealing with their hearts, remember they don't recognize Joseph, he's the leader in Egypt, and he's confronting them. Remember, one of them in chapter 42 says, is this not happening to us because of when we heard Joseph crying from the pit, we ignored him? I mean, they were so hard against him. They not only threw him into this well and sat down and ate, but listened to him crying out to him and ignored him and then sold him. That's how indifferent they were toward him. But listen to chapter 45, verses 5 through 8.
And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt.
So here you see them both. Joseph's brothers did sell him, but Joseph knows ultimately that God sent him. You see that relationship? God can use and does use man. He even uses the devil. Do you remember in I think it's 1 Chronicles, we're told that that God moves, incites David to number Israel. And then in 2 Samuel 24, we're told that Satan moves David to number Israel in sin. Well, which is it? Did God do it or did Satan do it? Right? God used Satan to incite David to number Israel. Right? Any problems with that with you? Thoughts about that? None? Are y'all awake this morning? Yeah, Pastor.
Genesis 50, 20, like just where you get an answer to all that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Luke, with Genesis 50 and verse 20.
As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today.
Now, did you notice in both of these sections that Luke read, we're given insight into God's purposes? To save lives, you know? Joseph went from the pit to the prison to the palace. And God had a purpose in all of those things. You don't know what your palace is if you're in the pit right now or in the prison right now suffering. But God has a sort of palace setting, so to speak, for you. In other words, God has a purpose for the troubles that you're going through right now, for the trials that you might be going through right now. There's a purpose in mind that God has. Remember, God is not ultimately concerned with our happiness, right? That's not the end game with God. Listen to Isaiah chapter 45. Thus saith the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by my right hand, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that the gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. I will shatter the doors of the bronze and cut through their irons. And I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden wealth of secret places, in order that you may know it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by your name. For the sake of Jacob, my servant, and Israel, my chosen one, I have called you by your name. I have given you a title of honor, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is none other. Besides me, there is no God. I will gird you, though you have not known me. God uses ungodly kings to accomplish his purposes, that he might be known and recognized by them. There's a purpose there. What we'll see in the end game is the phrase you see all throughout the Old Testament, I have done this for my own name's sake, God will say over and over again. In other words, for his glory. It's all ultimately for God's glory, right? Any thoughts so far? Comments? Questions? Yeah, Luke?
Yes, I think I mentioned last week, but I've been reading Job, and this kind of thing is so evident there. I mean, on Job's level, Satan is wreaking absolute havoc in his life. But from the heavenly vision, he's clearly under God's control. The commentary I'm reading, the guy quotes Luther, where he says Satan is God, Satan. I think that's kind of a helpful way to put it.
Now let's go back to the thought here of God not being the author of sin. How can God not be the author of sin and these things be so? That God moves hearts, that God changes hearts, that God permits sin, that God prevents sin. Doesn't that make God the author of sin? Well, that's where you get into what we call the law of concurrence. And again, as I said, there's some handheld outlines out on the back table when you go out there concerning God moving in hearts. And I have a couple little things on there that might help you if you want to pick one of those up. The law of concurrence is two equal parties, or not equal, I shouldn't say equal. Two parties that are working together to produce the same result, but with different motives. God has a motive. We've seen that in the story of Joseph, right? His brothers had a motive, and God had a motive, right? So the motives are different. The crucifixion of Christ, right? It was ordained from before the foundations of the world, and evil men did it. You say, but it was God's predetermined plan. Yeah, but they did it by wicked hands, we're told in Acts chapter 2. Here's what I find. Most people think that people are inherently good. They forget, like we're studying in 1 John, that mankind, since the fall, that men are spiritually dead. Right? Ephesians 2, 1 and 5. That they're morally dark. They love sin. They love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. that they're intellectually depraved or crooked, as Paul says in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 15, amidst the crooked and perverse generation. That's where you start with man. Man's not inherently good, and then God makes him do evil. He's already evil. God is just restraining that evil or allowing some of it. Right? And you see that in Romans 1, don't you? God removing his hand of restraint and giving them up and giving them up and then giving them over to a reprobate mind eventually. You see that? So God does not have to make people sin. God doesn't make people sin. He restrains them from it, or he permits them to do just what they want to do. Any thoughts on that? No? The second thing that we wanted to look at is the people of God. That is our position. What is our responsibility as children of light? 1 John 1:5, God is light, in him is no darkness at all. Jesus said he's the light. Then he tells his followers, you and I, that we are the light of the world. 1 Thessalonians 5:3 or 5:5 tells us we are children of the light, sons of the light. Ephesians 5:8 tells us we're to walk in the light. So how do we let our light shine? Well, by obedience. By obedience. Obedience to the government that God has ordained. That God is either restraining or permitting to do things that are right or are not right. So let me just give you three things, and then next time we'll dig into these more deeply. The first thing that we're to do is to submit, of course. Now, I don't want to give you the Romans passage. I wanted to give you another passage to look at and write down and consider. Look at Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. This is one maybe you're not familiar with. Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. I'll just give you these things, and then next week we'll look into them a little bit more deeply. Remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed, to malign no one, and to be uncontemptuous, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. You're not to be argumentative and slamming the rulers. Remember what Paul said in Acts 23? When he threw off on the ruler and they slapped him, and he said, I wish he wasn't God's high priest, because you're not supposed to speak evil of the leaders. Why? Because the leaders are ordained of God. I want you to study that passage, Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and tell me what you think about that. We're to submit in every way to the rulers. Obviously, unless they're telling us to do something that's absolutely wrong, we're still to submit. We're to pray for them. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, and look at the context there and why. There's several reasons, again, that God gives why we're to do that. Now, it's interesting to me that we'll complain about the government and we'll make all sorts of statements about them, but are we as Christians doing what God says we're to do? Are we praying for them? When's the last time you prayed for your governmental leaders? The bad ones, not good ones. When's the last time you thanked God for them or prayed for them? Right? And I don't mean the imprecatory psalms. You know, bash them, crash them, smash them, that sort of thing. I mean, when's the last time you actually prayed for them? When's the last time, and in what way did you honor them? Remember, and we'll see this in 1 Peter, Nero is ruling, who is vicious, ruthless. I mean, whether you like the current president or not, he's not torching Christians. Nero was. And yet, Peter says you're to honor the king, honor the emperor. You're to submit to them. You're to pray for them. So look at those. Those three things are what we'll look at next week. We're to submit to the leaders, we're to pray for them, and we're to honor them. Right? Any closing thoughts? Yeah.
One thing I was reading this week that would really be pertinent to this would be 2 Corinthians 4, 17 and 18. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. What is something I really had to wrap my head around. And like say, I've got somebody nailed, justice has to be served here, and say the prosecutor's office says, no, juries don't like it, we're going to let them get away with it. I had to fix my eyes on me so I don't come home a mess every day, angry every time.
That would be very difficult. Very difficult. Remember, our citizenship is in heaven. Philippians 3:20. We are not just in a foreign nation, so to speak. Remember, Peter calls us pilgrims, strangers, sojourners. We're ambassadors for the King, 2 Corinthians 5. That means that we are not only in a foreign country, we're actually in a hostile country. Satan is called the prince of this world several times in John, chapter 12, 14, and 16. It's called the god of this world, 2 Corinthians 4. The whole world lies in the lap of the evil one, 1 John 5:19. That's where you and I are, and we're God's ambassadors, proclaiming the message of our King, our coming King. And let's not forget, he sits in the heavens and he rules. He rules. Just because we don't understand the things that are going on does not mean that God is not ruling and reigning. Don't get yourself in the situation Job found himself in when he says, I wish God were here. Wish God were here. I'd ask him. He'd tell me. And then God shows up and Job says, I'm not going to say anything. And God says, yes, you are. You answer me. Tell me your wisdom. Right? Let's not get ourselves in that situation.